Thank you for attending our webinar today about how companies are thinking about returning to the office. My name is Christina Giordano, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices. To give some context for those who aren't familiar, AllVoices is an always-on employee listening tool used to ensure a culture of trust, inclusion, and transparency at companies around the world. We really value that psychological safety and culture of feedback. Customers really are in this high growth stage and value diversity, equity, and inclusion. And today we're specifically talking about how organizations are thoughtfully strategizing around return to work and whatever that looks like for them. We know that organizations like Twitter, Facebook, Shopify, and Siemens have announced that they will make remote work a permanent part of their strategy after a vaccine is available. And PwC UK is the first of the big four to announce a permanent flexible working policy as well. Another Zoom study found that 65% of respondents really want a hybrid approach, so not going fully back into the office or fully remote. And a lot of people are looking for that model as well. So we're going to really dig into what that looks like here today, and also talking about accessibility to jobs, onboarding new hires, and how leaders really need to operate with empathy in the state of our world. But I'm going to stop talking and we're going to start with intros. Monique, if you want to start, if you can share a little bit about kind of yourself, including your pronouns, and where you work today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christina. Hello, everyone. My name is Monique McCloud, she, her, hers, and I'm the Chief People Officer at Reformation, which is a sustainable clothing company. We are approximately 10 years old. We have 22 stores. We just opened a new store in Seattle, across the United States and the UK and Canada. We're rapidly growing and expanding, and we are approximately 500 employees in size and growing. So very, very pleased to be with everyone today, and thank you, AllVoices, for inviting me to speak with this wonderful panel today.
Awesome. Thank you for your intro. Arjen, do you want to go next?
Just unmuted myself. Hi there, everybody. My name is Arjen Mackaay. I'm the head of people at FabFitFun. FabFitFun is a women's lifestyle company from Los Angeles. We are based in West Hollywood and have a big fulfillment center in Chino. We've been around now actually since 2010, and we've had our subscription box, which we're mainly known for, since 2013. We are around like 700 employees, just to frame it for everybody on the call, with half of our operations in our fulfillment center. So definitely like an on-site type of operation, and the other half is in our HQ in West Hollywood. So pleasure to meet everybody, and looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. And last but not least, Dr. Seale, your intro.
All right, great. Hi, folks. My name is Dr. Shindale Seale. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the CEO of SEADE Coaching and Consulting. It's a diversity strategy, education and training organization for professional and academic entities. I'm also the founder of Our Community Mentors, which is a nonprofit organization that provides access to academic, professional, and quality of life resources for marginalized groups. I'm also the chair of the DE&I department for UC Santa Cruz Extension, where I teach the historical, legislative, and modern day implications of diversity. And I'm also a professor at University of Redlands, where I teach organizational change, organizational behavior, design, and leadership. So as you can see, I'm super, super lazy.
Yeah, I bet you're bored all the time. Everyone for being here today and sharing your thoughts about this really big topic that a lot of folks are starting to talk about, and that's returning to the office. Let's start from the beginning. In terms of thinking about a strategy for your company, how did you start preparing for this strategy? Arjen, I'll pass it to you first.
Yeah, sure. Like the tricky part here, I think, first of all, was to acknowledge that nobody knows what the timeline looks like, right? There's like just a lot of ambiguity around like the pandemic. When is it going to be safer for everybody? So there was a lot of questions I got in the beginning, like, hey, what is the plan? What are we doing? It's like, well, there's so many unknown variables. So let's just acknowledge for ourselves that, whatever we put out there right now, like it might still pivot some to the left or to the right. Like, we need to figure it out as we go along, right? So there's no guarantees at this moment yet. Look, I also think that it's important to think about for the future, like, even before you start the conversation, like, what do you want this culture to look like, right? And also like post-COVID, right? So you have like the two phases. You have like the during COVID, like what are you going to do to stay safe? A lot more focus on that, and then post-COVID, like, how do you envision your culture to be like? And I think it was what helped me a lot is also engage with our most senior leaders, so our founders, in that conversation. It's like, hey, you see as well what's going on. You're hearing from employees as well, just as I am. But like, how do you see our company in the future? Like, how are people working together? What is your vision on this? And so I engaged them like also very early on, and then brought up the conversation to also get input from all employees and other leaders as well. That's kind of how we got started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's really helpful to get kind of the voice of the employee and also know that things are going to change as well. Monique, how did Reformation start preparing for return to office?
So, I think most organizations, everyone was trying to predict when would it be safe to return to work, and it's going to be a really interesting exercise when COVID is in our past and not in our present, to go back and analyze how we made those decisions, because the answer, as everyone knows, is you can't, we still can't predict it. And you have to make, your best educated guess based on what was happening in the current moment. Mm-hmm. And so I think this is going to be it has been a real challenge for organizations and leadership to make decisions without information. You don't have a forecast. You don't have a budget. You don't have any predictors. You don't have information to help you make your decision, and you have to use judgment based on the information you have in front of you. And so I think the way that we approached it was, I made a judgment call based on the patterns that I saw last year. And despite the fact that everyone wanted assurances that we could go back into the office in January, I just said no. Mm-hmm. I'm making a judgment call based on the past evidence that I've seen and the information that we have in front of us that says when we thought COVID was going to spike. And I'm going to put a placeholder of June on the calendar so people can make arrangements and live their lives. And with our, emerging into that time period of returning to work, we put together a survey with all of our department leaders, because what we found was it's not really a matter of going back into the office anymore. It's really a question of, should we go back into the office? It's a totally different conversation now than I think what we expected to have a year ago. And so now what we're assessing is really the culture of the organization and how people work, and which functions need to, should, want to go back into the office, and for how many days per week, and which ones really can continue to work remotely, like permanently. And so that's the exercise that we're doing right now. And it's a very collaborative exercise where leaders are talking to their teams and making informed decisions together.
Yeah, I think it is definitely important to examine just the job function, but also the future of work is changing. We're not going to go back to this, normal. It's a new normal, for lack of a better.
Yes.
Christina, if it's just something that Monique said, actually, I thought was very interesting. And we're taking a similar approach where it might not be a one-size-fits-all for every team. And it's very similar to what Monique said. Like, we've also been discussing with individual leaders, like, well, what works best for your team, right? And you'll need to decide. Like, for some teams, like for instance, our engineering team was already quite adapted, working remote, etc. But we also have like a merchandising team that has products that they're touching, they're feeling, they're looking at, and so it was a much different need for them to be on site or to be in person than some other teams. So I've been having very similar discussions with individual leaders. Like, what do you think is going to be the most productive, the most efficient way for you? But I think you also need to have like the meta conversation, I guess, with your founders or with your CEOs. Like overall, what kind of culture are you envisioning, right? And how important is in person, right? And we're leading the same way as Monique, where it's a bit of a hybrid.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've heard culture a couple times now throughout the conversation. So Dr. Seale, I would love to ask, in your opinion, who should really be part of these conversations within the company, especially when we're talking about culture and psychological safety, like and physical safety going back into the office?
Well, that is a question that I always look at when through an organizational organizational change lens. Every framework, in every framework you find that speaks to successful transitions, it compels leaders to seek the initial and continued input of those who stand to be the most significantly impacted by the transition. So we look at the parents, right? We look at those with caregiving responsibilities, those who have been emotionally or professionally harmed by others in the workplace prior to COVID and during the remote work process. And why I say that is because we've seen that discrimination, bullying, harassment, and all of these have actually increased during remote work. So these conversations will need to be had to ensure that this new transition, this new infrastructure that you're building, that you're putting in place is equitable and that it holds everyone accountable. It's, we want to make sure that when we build this thing and don't be deceived, we are building something right now. This is literally construction, that each pillar of that constructed building or whatever that you're trying to create culture is it has the thoughtfulness, it has the approach where everyone is able to contribute what works for them. And like it was said, there are people who actually need to be on ground. Those people who really need to be on ground, they really should have a great deal of input as to how on ground should work for them, because it wasn't working before. So, so these are conversations and it would really create a great amount of psychological safety, especially when people feel as though they've got some buy-in, that they've got some ownership in how things are being created and crafted on their behalf.
Yeah, absolutely. We're definitely building an inclusive workforce, and we hopefully are right now. And we're thinking about ways in more what is the art of the possible and creative strategies. But part of what you said in terms of buy-in is getting that employee feedback, meeting employees where they are, no matter how comfortable they are sharing feedback with their managers anonymously. Monique, I would love to ask you, how do you capture and incorporate employee feedback into your kind of strategy?
Into our return to work strategy?
Yeah.
So we're actually having team meetings where employees, led by the department manager, the functional leader, where they're actually having this conversation and they're soliciting from the teams, how has it been? How have you been working together? What's been working? What isn't? It's interesting at Ref because we're a small company, but we're complex for our size in that we have retail employees who, quite frankly, don't have the option, right? They have to go into the store and serve customers. So that conversation is really more around safety and protection for them, and making sure that they feel protected in the workplace during COVID. And then we also have domestic manufacturing. We make a percentage of our clothes here in our facility in Los Angeles. So our craftspeople who are coming to work every single day got hit the hardest during COVID, and they have to physically come in to sew. And so they didn't have the choice And so safety was the focus and is the focus and the goal for them. But then you have your teams that are creative. We have designers, we have pattern makers, we have technical people, we have people that need to collaborate, they need to do fittings, they need to touch and feel the fabric. We have a marketing organization that's very creative, and they want to be together because that is how the creative process works. And so they can work from home, but they don't want to work from home every day of the week because they need those synergies, even cross-functionally, to be able to collaborate. And so we're asking them, what has worked well, what completely came off the rails, and not just by function, but within the team by function, what has worked for you so that you can continue to be the most effective as possible, but also collaborative and not feel distanced and excluded from the organization. And so we're asking them and we're collecting that feedback.
That's great. Arjen, how are you collecting feedback, especially kind of anonymous feedback, and also just making sure employees feel safe and empowered to share what they think about not only, return to office plans, but 365 days a year, how they're feeling as like the evolution of this strategy will change over time?
So our environment is, by the way, very similar to Monique's, where we have half of our population in a fulfillment center packing our subscription boxes. And so having to come in throughout the pandemic, right? And very similar to Monique, the thing that I wanted to especially test there is like, do they feel safe to come in? And safety is also a bit of a perception, right? So are the things that, beyond the technical things that we're putting in place, like air filtration systems or the infrared lights, right, that shine over the airflow, etc. Like aside from that, putting those technical things in place, do people feel safe? Right? And so in order to get feedback, I used the what I think is the correct 1-2 punch. It's basically culture amp for periodic surveys. We do it every 6 months. It's a big survey, get a lot of great sentiments through that. And then we use AllVoices for the everything in between, right? For the impromptu feedback. People give us a lot of feedback, which is phenomenal and awesome, and very grateful for that. And they do so through our all hands and submit questions to that. But they also send us reports through AllVoices, and I'm able to correspond with them in an anonymous way. So people feel, I get the impression they feel psychologically safe to give us that feedback, which is great. And especially in those moments, like you want to have a dialogue with them, right? You want to understand more of like where their sentiment or their perception is coming from, and how you might be able to help them. So in the fulfillment center, it was a lot more about safety and also uncovering areas where people didn't feel safe. Like, for example, somebody reached out to AllVoices like, that security guard is just not really doing the health checks at the entrance, and I don't feel safe because of it. And I was like, thank you so much for telling me. And like immediately, like the same day, engaged with that security person, right? But at our headquarters, for the people that work remote, I want to know, like, how are you doing working remote? And Dr. Seale said it as well before, which is where we also have a lot of working parents who also have their kids at home, right? And having to balance like being a parent and a tutor basically, and then also being a professional, it can be very stressful, right? And then there's also the people who were living by themselves. There was also, I noticed there was some like isolation driven anxiety popping up. And so having a tool like AllVoices where they're giving us feedback and they're kind of letting us know like when things are off has been extremely helpful. Because like the problem with not being in the office is you don't see people. Like I can't see somebody and tell that they're anxious or that they're nervous or that they're upset or frustrated. So I've had to rely a lot more on these type of tools or platforms to be able to keep the pulse on our population in these times.
Yeah, absolutely. I think kind of having that structure and having a holistic strategy of employee engagement, not just one time, not just having something, sent out and then forgotten about, is really important because employees are humans and feelings and emotions change all the time. Dr. Seale, I would love to ask, kind of in your opinion, we have talked about folks who might not feel safe returning to work for whatever reason. As Arjen mentioned, everybody has their own experience. And we saw a survey by the American Psychological Association last month that showed almost 50% of adults feel uneasy about returning to that kind of more corporate setting. How do you recommend working with those folks and really meeting them where they are?
I think the same as you've been working with them remotely. For those 49%, remote work has been a respite, and more so. It's probably kept their sanity. And for some orgs, it's reduced attrition, honestly. That reset helped a lot of people. So leaders are going to have to reimagine what their workplaces can be otherwise. They'll probably fall into that blockbuster trap, right? It's important to really think about what the possibilities are. You want to innovate in every way possible. It used to be that people had to be on site for certain things, right? It was the factories, the mills, This is where all of this coming together to work came from. It was, time and cost effective at the time. Now we see astoundingly cost efficient remote work can be done. So there are arguments about innovation, and it requires interaction. And I've seen that, and I've heard that. I'm hearing that from Monique. I'm hearing from Arjen that there's some people who want to be there. That innovation, that creativity, that synergy, that thing happens when they're together. Those people you don't really need to worry about. It's the others who don't want to return and who don't need to return for a reason. So you got to have those conversations, and you have to listen to what they're saying. If you can mitigate the issues that they're bringing to you, otherwise there are decisions that are going to have to be made. You're having people who are coming to you and they're saying, I don't feel safe with Bob as my manager. Well, how do you mitigate those situations, right? Well, why? And being able to delve into that is really, really what's important. AllVoices is an amazing platform, but behind AllVoices, you still have to deal with those situations. And so your leadership, your HR, your whoever you have in place needs to be trained on how to do that. And how to deal with the employees who don't want to come back, who don't feel safe coming back. If you can deal with that level of insecurity and psychological anxiety, then you may not even have to deal with people feeling unsafe coming back to work. You may be able to mitigate the situation and bring them back, with less friction. So, it's going to take a lot of thoughtful work. It's not just bringing them back. It's not just talking to them.
Yeah, it's not black and white. You need to have that, again, two-way conversation as well. And I do want to address someone's question in the chat. So if you do have a question, if you're in the audience, anything that we're talking about, if you have a question, please pop it in there. But Jake wanted to know, and 5 other folks, a lot of our employees are wanting to do a split between work from home and work in our office. We were thinking of moving to a hot desk system where employees can book a desk in advance. How are you setting policies that allow flexibility, but also make sure that investments into offices are worthwhile? Would low performers lose the ability to work from home?
Yeah.
Arjen, you want to start?
I read this question, and it's very similar both. What we're doing is we're actually giving the authority and responsibility to the managers, right? To the leaders of those departments. My general philosophy on HR is also that HR is actually not responsible for HR. It's actually line management, right? And HR helps to facilitate and supports that, right? But we really want to enable and empower our line managers to be able to decide together with their team, what works best for them. But it also includes, if there's somebody who's a low performer and you actually want to work with them more closely, that you might ask them to come into the office and be there, right? But I don't think it's a one size fits all. So to Jay's question, we're not creating strict policies on this. There's no formal policy there. It's more like you need to have the conversation with your manager, and in the end, your manager or the department leader will decide how it goes and how much the team works from home versus in the office, and ideally with the input from their team. right? But in the end, like and I think Dr. Seale alluded to it as well, somebody has to make that call, right? And one comment on the 49% figure, I've seen the sentiment shift like quite drastically throughout COVID. Like in the beginning when COVID was happening, there was a group of people who were like, get me out of the office. There's also a group who were like, oh my God, this is causing me so much anxiety now working from home. When can I come back? And I saw both groups flip. Right? So I saw the group that was like, oh, please get me back into the office, being like, no, actually, this is better like this. And now flip back, right? Where they're like, oh, wait, I've now maybe even gotten vaccinated, right? And I want to come back to that office and I want to be there. And look, some leaders are also envisioning them sitting there again with their team, brainstorming and just like it was pre-COVID, right? And other department leaders are just like, no, it's actually the way we're working right now and we're doing everything virtually works for me. So if you want to come to the office, that's more like because you want to be there, but I'm not like actually mandating it as much, right? So going back to the original question from Jake. So Jake, we are thinking about hot desking and hoteling as well, basically empowering leaders to discuss with their team when they're going to come in. But for that reason, like I don't think it makes any sense for people to have assigned desks or assigned offices. Even our executives are likely going to do hoteling, and there's only going to be a few people that actually have like an assigned workstation in the office. It's all going to be very flexible to make optimal use of the space, but also offer ultimate flexibility basically for people.
Can I throw a monkey wrench in here? As I'm known to do. I want to throw a monkey wrench into Jake's question. When we talk about low performers, when we talk about low performance and low performers, I always ask, how is low performance being defined? And who is defining low performance? Because we've seen where people may be in the office and they are killing it, but now they're at home at COVID and they're not. And so are we defining their performance based on this situational aspect? What factors are being considered? Because if they are being penalized based on their inability to work remotely and be productive remotely, then we need to consider how we are assessing people's work behavior and how they're able to adapt and work in these, extenuating situations. So also consider that when you're looking at how and who you are allowing to come back to the office based on performance. It's a lot more convoluted than I think a lot of us can admit.
Yeah, and if I may add, I'm glad that we're talking about this question, because when I saw the end of the question and it sort of slanted towards working from home or coming into the office being tied to performance issues, I would suggest everyone be cautious about that. In addition to the really insightful point that Dr. Seale made, I think we should think about working from home differently. I know the traditional way was, you would do it as an exception for people who were high performers because the perception was they didn't need to be as closely managed. They didn't need someone watching them. And I hope what COVID has shown most employers is that people are very productive without being supervised directly by someone watching them work. That work can be done in a very effective and efficient way without having someone over your shoulder clocking when you started and when you left. And, the workforce is different now. And, you hire people who are accountable and who know how to do their job, and you should trust that they're going to do their job well. And if there's evidence of that not happening, then you have a conversation about that. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that should change with whether you're home or at work. I know for me personally, I've worked so many more hours working from home than I did when I went into the office every day. Like the challenge is the flip side for a lot of people, that you have to turn it off. And also the caution around employers thinking that you're accessible for 24 hours a day just because you're online at home all the time. So I think we flipped, the pendulum has swung to completely the other side. And so we should be cautious about thinking of who you let work from home and who you let come into the office as a way of who do you need to supervise. Mm-hmm. There needs to be a different way of managing people now. And I think the pandemic has opened the door to the possibilities of how to be a better leader, period, because you're not assuming that someone is working because you see them, but you're actually looking at their output. And so that's, the only comment I wanted to make about that is to question aligning working from home versus working in the office with the perception around, does that person need to be managed closely?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, leadership has now changed so drastically that even the texts surrounding how leaders interact, it has to be rewritten. Yeah. It has to be how we gauge certain things, because if we're looking at how much, if you determine productivity by how much you produce, well, that's one thing. If you determine productivity by how many hours you're online, which a lot of leaders have now put monitoring software on their employees' computers. If you consider productivity or efficiency with how many meetings a person makes. So we've got leaders who are assessing productivity based on various things. And we have to be very, very cautious about how we provide our feedback based on that, and how we penalize. Why are we penalizing? First of all, there shouldn't be penalization. There should be conversations and then guidance. And so these are things that we really, really should be thinking and talking about.
I agree. I think it's an outdated way of leading. And I'm hoping that this pandemic provided some silver lining in such a horrible situation, that it provided an opportunity for people to think about how to lead differently. And I suggest shifting to outcomes. Organizations looking at outcomes, because you can spend a lot of time doing stuff and actually not be productive. And P.S., the very few employees that are gaming the system, they know how to game the system if you're tracking their time. They just keep their computers on and, go to yoga class. I mean, it's not hard to do. So it's a waste of time to track those things. It's really, what was the objective that you set to get done, for the quarter, for the month, for the week, and was it accomplished, and what is the quality of work? And if you can get that done in 5 hours, good on you.
That's right. I'm actually, we're having this conversation, like the one thing that I particularly have been worried about during the pandemic is actually more like burnout, more so than low productivity. Mm-hmm. I actually worry more that the person took, 8 hours, 12 hours to do something, was working until 2 a.m, and I have no idea.
Yep.
And so how I actually did, so we've been trying to figure out, like, how do we keep a pulse or check on that, more so than the performance side. I think we had to make a shift. The pandemic was a perfect forcing mechanism to just rip the Band-Aid off and be like, just get comfortable. Yeah, you're not going to be able to see your employee, but get comfortable with the fact that you can only pretty much manage based on results and outcomes, right? And I've seen at least a lot of our leaders make that shift and it's been working out pretty well. But I then worry that because it's so outcomes driven, right, that there's no boundaries there, right? And I think we're also you want to empower your employees to set those boundaries, right? And say, and create a psychological safety that they know they can. Mm-hmm. Right? But that's I've seen it as really hard.
It's hard
to adjust to that, and it's just not how many companies are wired. That's maybe the bigger shift.
Yeah, it's how we have been trained to be. Work has always been, overseer, worker, output. And now we're moving into a space where empowering your employees to be able to function productively and efficiently and effectively without those eyes on them is something where now it takes, for some people, the power away. Mm-hmm. And that power is strongly connected with their level, with the ego and with their level of influence. And if a leader can't lead without that power in their minds, influence is one thing, power is another thing. And our leaders really, really need to have an understanding as to how to leverage that and allow their teams to function in a way that they themselves are empowered and are making the decisions that are best for the company and for the department. So it definitely is a new brand of leadership.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about people leaders in general as well. Something that has been coming up in conversations is how do you empower employees? And someone asked in the chat as well, how you foster connectiveness as a manager if you have some employees that are working 100% remote, a hybrid approach, or fully in the office. But I would also add to that, how do managers really foster that kind of emotional and psychological safety within their teams, especially now as we're having this conversation too about performance, but also more generally that you're able to give that feedback to your manager, but also if you've never met them in person, how do you foster that in this new world of work? Arjen, I'll pass it to you first.
Sure. Before we go to the department level, I think at a company level, one thing that I hear a lot from my peers is that the connective tissue is kind of eroding, like during this pandemic, because people they're not running into each other as much anymore. I remember back in the day when I used to work for BCG, they used to call this collision, where people collide in the office and something happens, right? Mm-hmm. And that spontaneous connectivity I think is missing. So unless like we have a deliberate topic or a purpose, like why we're supposed to meet, like we're on the same team, or hey, there's something we need to solve together, we're not going to connect, right? And I've noticed also when I have been going into our office occasionally as well with a few others, and when I run into people who I normally don't talk to a lot, and when we have a conversation, it feels really good. And it's like, oh man, I know I did, that a person was like going through this, or that they were doing this, etc. So I've been thinking a lot about like how can we create more of that spontaneous connectivity across the company. And actually within the teams, like I think our leaders are doing a really good job of just like fostering a more like a connected culture within the teams, like having like a lunch together, right, or doing a happy hour, or connecting a certain time of the day or something like that. Like doing a good job, but across company, I think that there's like I'm experiencing a lot more struggle there. I recently started partnering with a company called Spoken. They Spoken without an E. They are actually very, I think, interesting and innovative company in this space. Like they took basically like an audio-based L&D platform, and they said like, well, what if you use this for internal comms? And I thought, I was like, that's brilliant. That's like, so think about like employees hosting their own podcast, or think about like your leader, your CEO, just leaving a voicemail for the company, or things like that. Like we're creating like I'm experimenting with things like that and with more innovative communication tools, because I think that the traditional stuff is a bit archaic, right? The all hands, the newsletter, etc. Like, what else can we do to connect people more? I really like, by the way, Slingshot, the platform that we're on right now. I never used it, and then last webinar we did the breakout rooms, and you'll see them at the end. I thought that was the way that's set up is really cool. Like you choose a table, you see who's on there, and you can connect with them. Like that's like the type of things that I think will help us foster the culture, and not just now, because look, in this future where I think we're going to still be remote or distributed to some degree. Like it will differ by company, but even post-pandemic, right? When the offices are open again, we'll still be like somewhat distributed. So this stuff is here to stay, right? And there's these challenges. So I'm kind of like preparing for the future in that sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Monique, how is Reformation really preparing their managers as well to foster that connectedness as well?
Well, the first thing we're doing is putting all people leaders through training. And so we found it was pretty evident that we needed to refresh just some basic skills training on management and diversity, equity, and inclusion. to give, our people leaders the reminder of what their responsibility is as a leader, and to also make sure that they have the tools, because I think, we're always talking about what employees need. We haven't had a lot of conversation about what managers need. And this has been a very, very stressful time for leaders as well, for people managers who need development, who need coaching, who need training so that they can be equipped to do the best job they can for their teams. And so we're focusing on that right now, starting with our executives, actually, and all the way through every people leader. And then the next thing we're doing is just making sure that the things that everyone sort of clung to culturally, that we can either recreate them in a way that's more equitable or replace them with something else. And it's interesting because what we found when we started evaluating that was that everybody wasn't included in those activities. Mm-hmm. And, very few organizations have all of their employees under one roof now. Whether there's, satellite locations or multiple offices or retail stores. And we found some differences between people who were in corporate roles versus the people that had to work in the distribution center or the factory that didn't get a chance to participate, hourly employees versus salaried employees. And what I found was it really wasn't a culture that everyone was participating in. So we broke that structure down and made sure that we were replicating everything throughout the organization so that everyone could participate. And I've had feedback from a lot of employees that are now participating in our DEI teams, our culture teams, et cetera, that it's what keeps them feeling connected to the organization and they couldn't participate before. So we just have to make sure that we're really being inclusive and that we're not assuming that what we did before was actually the best way to do things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think creating an equitable workforce, and also when you talk about culture, you're right. Who are you talking about? Are you just talking about corporate employees, like employees who are on the ground? And this goes to another question that came in from the audience too, is how do you make that employee experience equitable across the board as we're shifting to these different kinds of workspaces, physically, virtually? Dr. Seale, did you have anything kind of to add there as well in building these new systems?
Well, yeah, and that's a great question because equity is very subjective. When we start thinking about how someone experiences something, it requires us to be very thoughtful, very reflective on what they're saying. A mom of 3 toddlers would experience something vastly different than a mom of a teenager. Mm-hmm. And it is, so it's really important that we ask. I'm a big fan of asking. So, hey, you all want to join in this thing. What would it mean for you? What does feeling connected, what does feeling belonging mean to you? And for people, it's vastly different because we're raised in such different constructs. And I'm using constructs very, very deliberately. We're raised to feel certain things based on our environment. And when we're talking about creating equity within our organizations, it really is incumbent upon our leaders. And for those who are, have their ear to the ground and have some type of influence in the organization, to really sit with those people. And each individual group, it takes time, but if you're trying to do it, you need to make that investment. So I would definitely suggest having those listening circles, having those one-on-one conversations, really, really delving into what the experience they want, not what they want, but what experience do they want? Because a lot of times people can't tell you what would make them feel this way. They just know how they want to feel. And then you work from that. Is kind of this Kirkpatrick model in a way. You take from the end and then you go backwards. So I would certainly suggest that.
Yeah, listening. Look at the listening circles are definitely important. Arjen, did you have something to add?
Yeah, if it's okay, just on the topic of DEI, right? I think it's there's been a lot of reasons also in things that happened in our country, like the last year, why that become far more front and center. But even beyond that, like creating a truly inclusive work environment, like how do you do that? And one very interesting conversation I had recently was with a gentleman by the name of Anthony Clay. He runs a company called Indi, INDI, and it's his hypothesis is that, look, one thing that stands in the way of creating an inclusive work environment is homogeneous networks, right? It's basically that if you have an opportunity or something like that, or a project, who do you ask? You ask people that you know, and who do you know? You know the people in your team or at your level, or maybe even that look like you, right? And so, how do you break through that? And so he's been trying to solve that with his colleague Jason, and so they basically came up with this whole idea of a opportunity marketplace, right? Where opportunities can be promoted more. He has some like great mechanisms there also to make the selection for those projects like bias free. So, but as I was thinking about it, I was like, man, in this time, in this virtual time, the whole idea of the homogeneous network is even more reinforced, because I don't connect with people that they are not in my team or et cetera, or not in my network as much as I used to, because I used to just run into them in the office. So how do you break through that? So we think about D&I, like, and this is where we have to innovate here. We have to challenge ourselves there, because the conventional methods don't work as well in a virtual space. Like if I put up a notice on our message board, like nobody's going to see it because nobody's in the office, right? So what is the digital version of that message board? Or if there are job opportunities, right? Like people can't just walk into the recruiting office at this moment. So how are they going to know, right? And so how do I then distribute opportunities in a better way to open it up more to more people, so that more people have access? Basically, that's one particular thing. As you were going through that, Dr. Seale, I was like, that this is so front and center for me. It's something I've been trying to solve. So.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you actually said that, because I was actually just doing a training. We were talking about how you source for diverse candidates. And it's important that network that you spoke of, the homogeneous network, is that it becomes heterogeneous, right?
Yes.
So your sourcing needs to involve not just your regular go-to recruiting person, but it also needs to include HBCUs, HSIs, organizations that service diverse groups, LGBTQ, women, older workers, people with disabilities. Now, let me tell you, that right there is the largest minority in the United States, possibly the world, but only 33% of them are working, are people with disabilities. We are not sourcing to organizations that are providing skilled people with disabilities to our organizations. This is how we do that. So we do that by actually deliberately saying, okay, recruiting department, these are the areas, this is the network that I need for you to build. And when a job post goes out, it goes to all of them. And you won't have a problem getting diverse candidates. Now you just need to work on making sure that the bias within the hiring process in your organization is fixed. However you do that, with metrics or standardized. So yeah, that would be how you would solve that situation.
If I can add, it's a great point. Working remote, and someone did ask a question about nomenclature, and I do think nomenclature is important. I don't think organizations are having the conversation and defining terms the way we need to. So I just want to acknowledge that question in the chat. But working out of a centralized office has opened the door for more diversity in our applicants. And there are technical reasons that HR is familiar with around, where are you filing, and do you have payroll in the state? Are you paying tax? And there are technical things that hinder organizations from hiring anyone from anywhere. But that aside, when you don't have geography as a barrier, it opens the door for more diversity. And so I'd just like to ask, before we close the conversation, for any hiring managers or HR professionals on the call to really make a commitment to do the work. It is more work to have to source. It is more work to screen more candidates. It is more work to widen your aperture. It is more work to have to do a search than to go to the person next to you who gave you a recommendation, who's going to hire someone who's just like them. That is why we can't move the needle on diversity, because that habit of doing what is easy is keeping organizations from doing what is right and what is best for them. And so I know that, people are moving a lot, and there's a lot of jobs opening up because people are getting their, organizations are getting their money back, and the financial doors are opening, and there's a lot of movement. But let's make a commitment to not cheat the process, and let's make a commitment to do the work, because you can find people who will add to your culture, as Kat said in the chat, and not just fit your culture. And take on that challenge. Fitting in is not going to create a better organization for your company. It just isn't. And so let's leverage this opportunity to do better as organizations.
Absolutely. That's something that we've been talking about as well in terms of accessibility to opportunities. And I feel like everybody has been talking about, we have a huge opportunity to build these inclusive workplaces, not only for return to office or whatever workforce, whether you're doing a hybrid or fully remote role, to really think about how you want to build the future of work for your company. And we want it to be diverse. We want it to be inclusive. And it's going to take time and hard work. So we definitely want folks to have the opportunity to speak to our panelists one-on-one or in these smaller networking tables. But before we do that, the closing question I would ask just everybody is if there is a trend that you're seeing in kind of building this new system of work that companies really need to be aware of in order to be successful, what would that be? So, folks who are listening can keep that in mind as they're building their own strategies. Monique, I'll start with you.
Sorry, Christina, who was going first?
Monique.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
No, all good. So what trend have you been seeing in the future of work that companies need to be aware of?
The trend is that I've been seeing is employees want more role definition. This concept of and I think when you're working in an office and there's not a good onboarding and there's not good role clarity, you kind of put you bring employees on board and you say, well, there's enough people around them, they're going to figure it out. Go ask so-and-so in the blah, blah, blah section of the office and they'll help you, right? That doesn't work anymore. Because if you don't have role clarity and a good onboarding and a really good program to bring people on remotely, they're not just sitting there being non-productive, but they're also feeling useless, and they're thinking about whether or not they made the right decision for your organization, and they're going to start looking for another job, because people join companies because they want to contribute. They want to be a part of that team. They want to use their skill sets. And so I think that's the trend that I'm seeing, that it's going to be on employers to do a better job of.
Dr. Seale?
What I've been seeing, a lot of the data coming out now is this trend to upskill or reskill. And for obvious reasons, but the challenge here is that we're going back into this workspace, whether remote or on ground, that we're not quite sure what we need and what those skills are that we need that need to be upskilled to. We just know that there needs to be some upskilling. So the challenge is now for leaders to understand where they want to go within the next 6 months to a year, and then define the skills that are necessary for the people who they need to upskill. And now when we start talking about reskilling, we're talking now about really, really bringing in a more inclusive environment, a more diverse environment, because there are a lot of people who have skills that when we were on ground were not sufficient. Now we need to really look at where it is that we're trying to go and how we can bring everybody together there to be contributing in a way that is productive and then effective for the organization. So I've been seeing that a lot, but there hasn't been a lot of real clarity on what skills we are reskilling and upskilling for. So I'll keep my ear to the ground on that and keep you posted.
Please do. And last but not least, Arjen, what are you hearing?
Yeah, I think there's there's going to be more of a push, but also like this is a bit of a gap at this moment for asynchronous work, right? So if you work on the East Coast or something like that, like you are right now, Christina, like, how can you and I work together without you having to work West Coast hours, right? Yeah. And so how can we be productive in that way? So I think we're going to see more solutions pop up that facilitate that more. And also look at offering more flexibility to employees. Like even if you're in the same time zone, the same city, like maybe you work different hours, right? And offering flexibility there. And I'm also thinking, Dr. Seale, for something that you said, like how can you engage more groups that are currently not in the labor force, like to engage more? Like, well, hours is another way, right? Like can somebody do the same work on the weekends versus during the week if they have other things going on during the week? Like so, asynchronous. I think the other thing, especially that I've been focusing on a lot, is like any solution or any tool or whatever we use needs to be virtual first. So it has to be enabled for the virtual world, right? Even like for the stuff we have in our future office, right? It has to enable for people to be able to dial in remote and engage remote the same way that people are in the office. It shouldn't be that, okay, we're in a room together, we're brainstorming, the person on the Zoom or on the call is at a disadvantage, right? So it's like, how can you do it in a way that they're included and that they're just as much part of that conversation and that brainstorming as the people who are in the room? And then lastly, like I just to go full circle here, I do think like we're going to move to a lot more of like a flexible model that seems to be where the vast majority of the companies are going. So empowering leaders and employees to basically decide together what is the most productive for them. And so we need office facilities and tools that enable that level of flexibility. I think that's also pretty key. And like trust each other, right? That you're there. There's assume positive intent, right? And everybody's there to do the right thing for the company. And then for those I forgot if whether it's Monique or Dr. Seale said that, but if you have bad actors, they're gonna game the system no matter what. But let's assume that the vast majority of people is here because they have a positive mindset and they want to be here and they have passion for the company. So then empower them to figure it out, right? And what will be the most important.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for sharing your insights with us and trends you're seeing in the market. We're definitely going to look out for those things and incorporate them in our people strategy and also return to office strategy, whatever that may look like. And also, we are going to break out into virtual tables for our panelists. If you would go to a separate table, if you have a couple minutes to stick around and want to ask a question, we also will link their LinkedIns afterwards in this recording. But to reiterate, for those who aren't familiar with AllVoices, we truly believe in the value of employee feedback to foster what we've been talking about, this culture of trust, inclusion, and safety in the workplace, because transparency really benefits everybody in the workplace. And we believe in that psychological safety and empowering all employees to speak up. So if you're interested in learning more, please feel free to reach out to myself or a member of my team. A huge thank you to Dr. Seale, Monique, and Arjen for spending this afternoon with us.